people found dead inside a building on Skid Row.
LA fire officials believe all 3 deaths were due to overdoses, raising fears that a new dangerous drug may be spreading here in Southern California.
50,847 crimes per 100,000 residents. That's the number that defines Skid Row in Los Angeles. To put this into perspective, the average for the rest of LA sits around 3,100. So we're talking about a crime rate that's triple what the city experiences. And here's what makes it even more disturbing. All of this happens within just 0.4 square miles. 50 blocks, that's it. Located in downtown Los Angeles, this area officially goes by Central City East, but nobody calls it that. The boundaries run from 3rd Street on the north side down to 7th Street, and from Main Street on the west to Alameda Street on the east. If you were to walk it, you could cover the whole thing in maybe 20 minutes. But those 20 minutes would take you through what many consider the most dangerous urban zone in America. The violent crime rate here hits 4,012 per 100,000 people. Property crimes add another 5,301. When safety organizations grade neighborhoods, Skid Row gets an F, placing it in the 1st percentile, the absolute bottom. And if you're wondering what that means in practical terms, here's the reality. 1 out of every 37 residents will become a victim of violent crime this year. That's 367% above the national average. Now, the thing that really gets me is the geography of it all. We're talking about a zone that sits minutes away from some of the most expensive real estate in California. Luxury lofts, high-rise condos, trendy restaurants. And then you cross Main Street, and suddenly you're in what residents themselves describe as the dividing line between those who have everything and those who have nothing. Over 4,400 people without homes live concentrated in these blocks. This represents the largest stable homeless population anywhere in the United States, not scattered across a city, not spread through a region, concentrated, packed into 50 blocks where the rules seem to operate differently than everywhere else. Fire Station 9, located right in Skid Row, responds to approximately 20 violent incidents every single week. July 2024 alone saw multiple shootings, dozens of assaults, and countless thefts. The station is the busiest in all of Los Angeles, and the firefighters there have seen things that would make most people's blood run cold. But what does it actually mean when we say law doesn't exist here? We're not talking about the absence of police. Officers patrol these streets constantly. What we're describing is something more systemic. Drug markets operate in broad daylight, right out in the open. Fentanyl arrests increased by 250% in 2025, yet the supply never seems to diminish. Approximately 5 people die from overdoses in this area every single day. Gangs control which tents can operate where. Stolen goods get resold in makeshift supermarkets set up under tarps. The police know about these operations. Everyone does. But the volume of activity simply overwhelms any capacity to respond effectively. And here's what nobody wants to say out loud. This place didn't happen by accident. It was designed. Decades of policy decisions created exactly what exists today. The story of how 50 blocks became a human containment zone reveals something deeply uncomfortable about the choices we make as a society. Something we'll need to understand if any of this is ever going to change. To understand what Skid Row is today, you need to go back to the late 1800s. Los Angeles was growing fast back then, and that growth required cheap labor. Railroads needed workers. The port needed longshoremen. Farms needed seasonal hands. All these men, mostly young and single, needed somewhere to sleep. And that's how Skid Row was born. The area filled up with single-room occupancy hotels, what people called SROs. These weren't fancy places. We're talking about small rooms, shared bathrooms down the hall, and rent paid by the week. Bars opened up, brothels followed. The term Skid Road actually comes from loggers who used to slide timber down greased paths, and somehow it evolved into a description for places where society's forgotten ended up. By the 1,930 during the Great Depression, up to 10,000 homeless people lived in these blocks. The area had become a permanent feature of the city, a place for alcoholics, for people down on their luck, for anyone who had fallen through the cracks. But then came the post-war period, and with it, something that would shape everything that followed. Urban renewal projects swept through American cities in the 1,950 and 60 seconds. The idea was to tear down old, run-down buildings and replace them with modern development. In Skid Row, this meant demolishing the cheap housing that actually gave people a roof over their heads. The number of affordable units dropped from 15,000 to just 7,500. Thousands of people were displaced with nowhere else to go. Then came the 1,970 seconds. And this is where things get really interesting. Los Angeles had a problem. Developers wanted to renovate downtown, turn it into something modern and profitable. But what do you do with all the poor people already living there? The activists fought to protect residents. The developers pushed for change. And the mayor at the time, Tom Bradley, needed to find some kind of compromise. The solution they came up with was called the Blue Book Plan. The idea was simple, in a disturbing kind of way. Instead of spreading services for homeless people throughout the city, they would concentrate everything into one specific area. Those 50 blocks we've been talking about, more than 70 nonprofit organizations moved in, the Union Rescue Mission, the Midnight Mission, dozens of others. On paper, it looked like compassion. In practice, it created a containment zone. All the poverty, all the addiction, all the mental illness, all the crime concentrated into one small geographic area. The rest of downtown could develop without having to look at it. Critics have a name for this: structural violence. And 50 years later, the experiment is still running exactly as designed. The 1,980 seconds hit Skid Row like a wrecking ball. Actually, two wrecking balls at the same time. First came the crack cocaine epidemic, flooding the streets with a drug that was cheap, incredibly addictive, and devastatingly destructive. Second came deinstitutionalization, a fancy word for shutting down psychiatric hospitals across the country. Suddenly, thousands of people with severe mental illness had nowhere to go. Many of them ended up on the streets. Veterans returning from Vietnam, struggling with what we now call PTSD, but back then just got called weakness, found themselves abandoned by the very government they'd served. The population of Skid Row changed. It became sicker, more addicted, more vulnerable. And then the police decided to respond with force. In 1987, LAPD Chief Daryl Gates launched massive raids targeting what he called vagrants. The idea was to sweep the streets clean, arrest people for minor infractions, and make Skid Row less visible to anyone who might be visiting Los Angeles. Officers went through the area, arresting people for sleeping on sidewalks, for asking for spare change, for simply existing in a space the city didn't want them to exist in. The result? Jails filled up. The problem remained exactly the same. People who got arrested would get released days or weeks later and return to the exact same streets. The cycle just kept spinning. But then came 2006 and something called the Safer Cities Initiative. This was based on broken windows policing, a theory that says if you crack down on minor offenses, you prevent major crimes from happening. In Skid Row, this meant arresting people for jaywalking, for littering, for urinating in public because there were no bathrooms available. The numbers are staggering. 18,000 arrests in Skid Row during this initiative. The arrest rate was 69 times higher than the Los Angeles average. 69 times. And sure, the crime statistics dropped temporarily, but something else happened that nobody seemed to anticipate. When you arrest someone for a minor offense, they get a criminal record. And when you have a criminal record, it becomes nearly impossible to get a job. Without a job, you can't afford housing. Without housing, you end up right back on the streets. The very policy designed to reduce homelessness was actually creating more of it. Every arrest meant one more person trapped in the cycle with no way out. In 2019, the ACLU won a lawsuit that limited how police could confiscate belongings from homeless people, a small legal victory. But by then, decades of punitive tactics had already done their damage. The streets of Skid Row remained exactly as chaotic as they'd always been. Let me walk you through something that happens every single day in Skid Row. It's not random chaos. It's actually a surprisingly organized system that most people never think about. Start with the supermarkets. That's what people call certain tents that operate as resale operations for stolen goods. Here's how it works. Someone struggling with addiction needs money for their next fix. They walk a few blocks outside of Skid Row, steal merchandise from a store, maybe grab a bicycle that wasn't locked up properly, and bring it back. They go to one of these supermarket tents, hand over what they took, and receive either drugs or cash in exchange. The goods then get resold at reduced prices: clothing, electronics, tools, bicycles. If you're looking for a deal on something that probably fell off a truck, so to speak, Skid Row has what you need. This cycle sustains itself. Theft funds, addiction. Addiction requires more theft. And the gangs control which tents can operate and where they're allowed to set up. Nothing happens without their permission. Now, the drug market itself is worth examining. Fentanyl and methamphetamine dominate. But here's something interesting about the preference between them. A lot of people in Skid Row actually prefer meth over fentanyl. Why? Meth keeps you awake and alert. On the streets, falling asleep in the wrong place can get you robbed, beaten, or worse. Meth also creates paranoia, which leads to aggressive and sometimes violent behavior. The violence isn't random, it's chemically induced. Fentanyl, on the other hand, kills faster. We mentioned earlier those 5 daily overdose deaths. That's the fentanyl. The tents that sell it function as fixed retail points. Buyers know exactly which tents to go to. The police know too. Everyone knows. But the sheer volume of transactions overwhelms any possible response. Breaking down the crime statistics from a 2019 study that looked at 997 incidents within a half-mile radius, 25% were physical assaults, 13% were robberies involving violence. Less than 1% were homicides, though each one represents a devastating loss. Larceny and theft made up about 55% of all incidents. The violence follows patterns: disputes over territory between dealers, unpaid drug debts, personal conflicts that escalate because everyone is on edge, sleep-deprived, and often paranoid from stimulants. When victims get attacked, they rarely report it. Why would they? Fear of retaliation is real. Distrust of police runs deep after decades of punitive policies. Many crimes never make it into official statistics at all. And what about the police presence? LAPD officers patrol constantly. They're not absent. Officer Dion Joseph has worked these streets for 27 years, but the approach is reactive, not preventive. By the time something happens, it's already happened. The system manages chaos. It doesn't eliminate it. That's by design, whether anyone wants to admit it or not. Numbers tell one story, the people living them tell another. Let's talk about the women first, because what happens to them in Skid Row is particularly horrific. More than 90% of women in this area have experienced physical or sexual violence. 90%. Women make up about 34% of the population here, and many of them originally fled domestic violence in their homes. They escaped abusers only to encounter more violence on the streets. The shelters are overwhelmed. Some women avoid the family-oriented ones entirely. Why? Because after losing their own children, being surrounded by other people's kids is unbearable. Women who are undocumented fear that reporting attacks will get them deported. Women on parole fear that any contact with law enforcement will send them back to prison. The perpetrators know this. They rarely face any consequences. There's a woman named Robles who's been documented in reports from the area. She's 51 years old, been on the streets for 2 years. Before that, she was a widow who lost everything after her husband died. She has survived knife attacks and sexual assaults. The gangs control access to safer sleeping areas within the tent communities. Day and night blur together when your only focus is making it to tomorrow. Another woman, her name withheld, holds a PhD in religious studies. She ended up homeless after an abusive divorce, combined with health problems that made it impossible to work. She's watched business owners literally spray water at homeless people like they're pests. Her observation, this treatment would be unthinkable in other countries. The irony isn't lost on her, given that America often lectures the world about human rights. There's Jennifer, a woman with mental disabilities. Childhood bullying contributed to her developing schizophrenia. On the streets, she faces constant intimidation. People have stolen her pets. A photographer named Suzanne Stein documented her resilience, capturing moments of personality and spirit that most people would never expect to find in these circumstances. Veterans deserve special attention here. They make up about 10% of Skid Row's population, and nationally, they represent roughly 20% of all homeless people. Many carry PTSD from Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. The Veterans Affairs system doesn't reach them all. Combat trauma combines with street trauma. Without proper treatment, addiction becomes self-medication. And then there's the perspective from inside the system. Officer Dion Joseph has worked Skid Row for nearly 3 decades. He talks about a woman who'd been a resident for 15 years. She flagged him down one day after being beaten by her abuser. Before that, she told him that police don't care about addicts. After he arrested the man who hurt her, she smiled, and he noted how rare that was, how meaningful it felt. Everyone wants to feel that someone cares about them. Joseph also describes cases without resolution. A young woman stabbing the ground with a spoon, completely unreachable, trapped somewhere in her own mind. He fought back tears watching her. God knows her name, he said, even if nobody else does. COVID-19 changed everything and nothing at the same time. When the pandemic hit, Los Angeles suspended evictions from homeless encampments. The official reason was public health concerns. You can't force people to move during a deadly outbreak. The result? The number of tents exploded. The city installed 360 hand-washing stations. Mobile showers started making rounds. But here's the thing. The pandemic just exposed what had always been true. People were living without running water, without toilets, without basic sanitation. The virus simply made it impossible to ignore. The emergency measures that got implemented were basically acknowledging that these people had been surviving without the bare minimum of what humans need. Once the pandemic settled down, a lot of those temporary solutions stayed in place, because they were actually addressing problems that existed long before anyone heard of COVID. Let's talk about something called patient dumping, because it reveals how the system actually views Skid Row. Hospitals in Los Angeles discharge patients who have nowhere to go. People recovering from surgery, people with psychiatric conditions, people with chronic illnesses that require ongoing care. Instead of finding them proper placement, hospitals put them in wheelchairs, drive them to Skid Row, and leave them there. In hospital gowns, without medication, without any plan for follow-up treatment. This practice has resulted in lawsuits and settlements totaling more than $4 million. You'd think that would stop it. It hasn't. The fines and settlements are still cheaper than providing actual care. The hospitals solve their problem by transferring it to those 50 blocks. Skid Row absorbs what no one else wants to deal with. There's also the migrant situation, adding pressure to an already overwhelmed system. Recent arrivals from Nicaragua and Venezuela end up in Skid Row tents because there's nowhere else for them to go. The services that existed before weren't adequate for the existing population. They certainly can't handle the additional demand. Tensions between longtime residents and newcomers sometimes flare up. Resources haven't increased proportionally. The nonprofit organizations work at the absolute edge of their capacity. Looking forward, there's something called the DTLA 2040 plan. It's an urban development proposal that could change zoning in downtown Los Angeles, including the Skid Row area. Resident coalitions like Skid Row Now and 2040 are fighting back. They've seen this movie before. In the 1,970 seconds, development meant displacement. Cheap housing got demolished. Poor people got pushed out with nowhere else to go. There's real fear that the same pattern will repeat. The question is whether this time anyone will actually build alternatives before tearing down what exists. After everything we've covered, here's what nobody in power wants to admit. The containment strategy has been running for 50 years, and it hasn't solved anything. The homeless population hasn't decreased. The crime rate hasn't dropped. The addiction crisis hasn't improved. By every measurable outcome, the policy is a failure. But maybe failure isn't the right word, because if you look at what the policy actually accomplishes, it works perfectly. The luxury developments right next to Skid Row, those exist precisely because the poverty is contained in one place. Developers can build expensive condos knowing that the undesirable elements are concentrated elsewhere, kept in a zone where their presence is expected and managed. Politicians can point to the 70 nonprofit organizations and claim that services are available. The voting public in wealthier neighborhoods doesn't feel urgency because the problem is kept at a safe distance. Everyone wins except the people actually living in those 50 blocks. Here's the economic reality that makes no logical sense. Keeping a person homeless costs more than housing them. Hospital visits, emergency room treatments, arrests, court processing, jail time, shelter stays, the repeated cycle of services that never break the pattern. Studies have consistently shown that permanent supportive housing reduces all of these costs. But permanent housing requires upfront investment. Politicians avoid upfront investments because the benefits don't appear until after the next election. Skid Row isn't unique, by the way. Kensington in Philadelphia looks almost identical. The Tenderloin in San Francisco follows the same patterns. Albuquerque has what locals call the war zone. Every major American city has developed its own version of this containment strategy. Concentrate poverty, provide some services, keep it away from the taxpayers who vote. None of these zones have solved homelessness. All of them have successfully managed visibility. What's interesting is what exists despite all of this. There's actually community in Skid Row. The Los Angeles Poverty Department has been creating theater productions with homeless performers since 1985. The Festival for All Skid Row Artists has been celebrating creativity since 2009. The Skid Row City Limits mural, painted in 2014, claims identity for a place that most people only see as a problem. Weekly karaoke nights build connections between people who have nothing else. The resilience is real. It exists in spite of the system, not because of it. And that might be the most damning indictment of all. 9,847 crimes per 100,000 residents isn't just a statistic. It's the accumulated result of decisions made over decades by people who never had to live with the consequences. The law didn't disappear from these 50 blocks. It was designed to operate differently here. Until that changes, Skid Row will remain what it has always been, a mirror reflecting exactly what we as a society are willing to tolerate.